Hello, everyone. Welcome to another MEERTALK. My name is Kaisa Fern, and I'm the Director of Communications at MEER. We are so glad to be getting together for another MEERTALK today. We will be hearing from our guest speaker, Charlie Gardner. Then we'll have a question and discussion period from our MEER community. And after that, we will open it up for questions from all of you in our audience today. I want to let you know that we now have MEER experiments up and running, and we're appreciative of any donations you can make to support experimental materials and related costs. If you can, please make a monthly donation. You can go to meer.org/donate. And we really do thank you so much for those of you who are contributing already. You could also write to community@meer.org to be in touch. So I will tell you about Charlie Gardner. Charlie Gardner is a conservationist and activist interested in the interconnections between the climate and ecological crises, academic activism, and the role of individual action in the planetary emergency. He's a member of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion. If anyone has any questions that come up while Charlie is presenting, you can send them to Barbara in the chat, and Barbara will be showing up as co-host in just a moment. Okay, Charlie, well, thank you so much for being with us today. We're really interested to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Kaisa, and thanks everyone for this invitation. I'm really happy to be with you here today. So I'm going to talk to you today about the latest installment of the IPCC, their 6th assessment report, which was published a little over a month ago now, and was billed as, well, as every IPCC report is actually, as a final warning in the media. A couple of caveats first. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a conservation scientist. My background is in ecology and conservation of the natural world. As Kaisa said, I'm interested in the interrelationships between climate change and the destruction of the natural world. So I have no specialist knowledge of climate change. In particular, I have no specialist knowledge of ground-based solar radiation management, although I'm excited to hear more about it, of course. I also have no particular insight into the IPCC process. I'm not involved in it and never have been. However, I was asked to prepare some materials synthesizing what's in this latest report. So what I'd like to do to you today is pull out some of the key contents of this report that I think will be interesting to a MEER audience. Bear in mind, this is, I'm coming at this report as an outsider. I'm just looking at what is and isn't said in this publicly available document. So, as you all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a UN body. It doesn't do its own research. It synthesizes research that is out there, published in peer-reviewed literature, and every 6 or 8 years, they produce these massive assessment reports, and this was the 6th one. It's nothing in this assessment report is actually new because it's composed of the 3 working group reports that were published in 2021 and 2022. Physical Science, Working Group 1, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and Working Group 3 on Mitigation. What's important about this report is not just that it brings those 3 reports together, but really because these assessment reports are produced in such long 8-year cycles, the next one won't be until 2028 or 2030. And if we have not already made, massive strides on the decarbonisation transition by then, it will be too late. So that is why it's billed as the final warning. So bear in mind, what has been published is the summary for policymakers. The full report is about 6,000 pages and it hasn't been published yet. All we have is this 36-page summary for policymakers. obviously we can all imagine that there is a selection process that goes on when we're condensing a 6,000-page report into a 36-page report. And we need to bear in mind, of course, also that the summary for policymakers isn't just a scientific document, it's a politically agreed document. It's agreed by the authors and the government delegates. So I'm not here to dunk on the IPCC. The IPCC is fantastically important, and I think the work it produces, given the context in which it operates, is really fantastic. However, we need to be aware of the context in which it operates. Because the full report hasn't been published yet, we're not aware of differences in language between the full report and the final report. But when the working group 3 was published last year, that was preceded by a leak of a draft version that was leaked by Scientist Rebellion. And this provided some comparison of the leak and the final published version, allows us to get some insight into the influence of the political process. For example, the language was changed on fossil fuels, whereas in the original draft it referred to phasing out all fossil fuels. There was political pressure from Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations, and it ended up referring to fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. So yeah, a big change in meaning there. Similarly, on dietary change, language on that explicitly referred to diets with a higher share of plant-based protein, following pressure from Brazil and Argentina, which are big beef-producing countries. Reference to plant-based protein was removed, and it just referred to sustainable, healthy diets. So again, none of this is to suggest that there is any issue with any of the core science presented in the IPCC reports. It's all absolutely rock solid. However, the framing of that science, the language in which it is framed and presented, it's worth bearing in mind the processes behind that. So this last report was arranged around 18 headline statements. And I can't go over all of it. There's far too much in there. But what I've done is I've ranged these headline statements by theme, and we're just going to look at some of the key things that I think will be of interest to this audience in particular. So what does the report say about climate change so far? Well, it says human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming, with mean surface temperature reaching 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. 1.1 degrees is a global average. Warming has been greater on land than on the sea. Warming over land is already at 1.6. And all of the impacts we're already seeing globally are already occurring at this global average of 1.1 degree. And yet our governments have decided that the safe level is 1.5 degrees. Clearly, given all the impacts of having a 1.1, 1.5 is not safe. That's very clear. This is perhaps one of the starkest sentences in the whole thing when we think about it. It says simply, global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase. They're still rising. This isn't the first report, it's the 6th report. We've been talking about this for decades. Governments have been promising action for decades. Emissions are still rising despite everything. And almost over 40% of emissions since 1850 have been since 1990. 1990 was just 2 years before governments agreed, when they launched the UNFCCC to start dealing with this seriously. So almost half of all emissions have been since we agreed to deal with the problem. We have emitted as much in full knowledge of the consequences as we ever did in ignorance beforehand. Knowledge clearly is not enough. Clearly producing IPCC reports is not sufficient. It's hugely important. It's critically important, but it is not sufficient on its own. And And then there's lots of information about unequal historical and ongoing contributions, unequal between countries, unequal within countries, and very clear idea here that emissions aren't, it's not a problem about people, it's not humanity driving emissions, it's consumption and wealth. What's particularly interesting in this section on observed warming and its causes is section A.1.2, where it says, over this period since 1850, it is likely that well-mixed greenhouse gases contributed a warming of 1.0 to 2.0 degrees, and other human drivers, principally aerosols, contributed a cooling of 0.0 to 0.8 degrees. So this is a reference to the aerosol masking effect. I'm sure you're all aware of this. When we burn fuels, we release greenhouse gases, which warm up the planet by the greenhouse effect, but we also release aerosols, small particles, which have a cooling effect and masking effect through reflectance, through the impact they have on solar radiation, nothing to do with the greenhouse effect at all. Here, the IPCC says very clearly, it acknowledges the existence of this aerosol masking effect that has had some cooling impact. However, it's the only mention of aerosols in the entire report. The word aerosol appears twice. The second one is a footnote about volcanic aerosols. So this to me is a bit of a concern. It raises the idea of the aerosol masking effect, but it doesn't ever talk about the risk of weakening it through decarbonisation. So it raises this spectre and then just no further discussion. So what does it say about what will happen in the future? Continued greenhouse gas emissions will lead to increasing global warming, with the best estimate of reaching 1.5 degrees in the near term in considered scenarios and pathways. So basically, in this report, the IPCC used 5 projections, not predictions, but projections for how things may turn out in the future, called shared socioeconomic pathways. And these are basically different emissions scenarios. What's really terrifying is they say, under the very low emission scenario, so the best case scenario, we will reach 1.4 degrees by 2100 following a temporary overshoot of no more than 0.1 degree. So if I interpret this right, the IPCC is saying in the best case scenario, we will go past 1.5 and then hope to come back and reduce it later back to 1.4. And we'll come back to this idea later. More worryingly, the intermediate emissions scenario will lead to 2.7 degrees, 2.7 by the end of this century, and the very high emissions scenario to 4.4 by the end of this century. They do state that scenarios leading to greater than 4 degrees are unlikely and would require a reversal of technology and policy. However, there's a big asterisk there, and I'll come back to it. This is another interesting point as well, I think, for the SRM community, is it says sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions would lead to discernible slowdown in global warming within around 2 decades. In other words, there's a big time lag between decarbonisation and slowdown. In other words, if we need rapid ways to decrease temperature, decarbonisation, emissions management, and it isn't necessarily going to be that because of the time lag. And then it states we're going to hit 1.5 by 2040. Here it shows these 5 different scenarios in graphical form. The bottom bar shows the very low emission scenario. I don't know if you can see the bars there, but the color of the bars indicates that it will surpass 1.5. What's great about this figure is the graphical representation of the different stakes of the different stakeholders depending on our age. And I think there's this really nice representation of of intergenerational equity here that yeah, I like it a lot. Okay, so what does it say about climate change impacts and related risks? It says, for any given future warming level, many climate-related risks are higher than assessed in the last report. So for any level of warming, they're going to be much worse than we thought they were going to be, right? And they're also going to be multiple times higher than currently observed. Things are going to be much, much worse. Risks and projected adverse impacts and related losses and damages escalate with every increment. So the hotter we let it get, the worse things will be. However, by implication, every fraction of a degree counts. We'll skip past that, sorry, just in the interest of time. Here is a really terrifying section to me. Of the 18 headline statements, one of them was entirely about overshoot. And it says, if warming exceeds a specified level, such as 1.5 degrees, it could gradually be reached again by achieving and sustaining net negative global CO2 emissions. This would require additional deployment of carbon dioxide removal. In other words, it says if we go past 1.5 degrees, we can just come back again by using carbon dioxide removal, sucking it out of the atmosphere. Big, big question marks over this, which, to be fair, it does raise. It says this would lead to greater feasibility concerns. I don't like this phrase, feasibility concerns. In other words, we don't know if this is feasible. It's, you know, the technology doesn't exist at scale. It doesn't exist reliably. I think feasibility concerns is a bit of a euphemism. I wouldn't want to be too over-reliant on these, you know. The other thing that's really worrying about this idea of overshoot entails adverse impacts, some irreversible, and additional risks for human and natural systems, all growing with the magnitude and direction of overshoot. In other words, it's saying, despite what we said about we'll be able to just undo overshoot, we might not be able to, because overshoot might lead to irreversible things that we can't undo, particularly via carbon cycle feedbacks, increased wildfires, mass mortality of trees, drying of peatlands, permafrost thawing, weakening natural land carbon sinks, and increasing releases of greenhouse gases. So to me, I find it really worrying that there is such just an upfront section about this idea of overshoot, because it's normalizing and legitimizing the idea. I think we cannot accept the idea. It's just, you know, it's another example of slippage of our targets, isn't it? You know, 30 years ago, 1.5 was, we must absolutely never, ever, ever get there. Now it's, let's try to get to 1.5. And then even now, it's like, oh, actually, it doesn't matter if we miss 1.5 because we can just go backwards. We cannot legitimize this idea. Okay, so what does it say about the risks of the worst outcomes? Some future changes are unavoidable and or irreversible. This particularly refers to changes to the biosphere, you know, loss of biodiversity. If we lose tropical forests and coral reefs, you know, that's irreversible. The likelihood and impacts of abrupt or irreversible changes in the climate system, including changes triggered when tipping points are reached, increases with further warming. Obviously, this is obvious, it's common sense, but it says here explicitly, the hotter we let it get, the bigger the risks of abrupt and irreversible changes. Worrying stuff. It talks about the risk of very large adverse impacts and how these increase at higher temperatures. One thing that actually quite astonished me was there was a footnote, not even in the main report, right? A footnote that says warming levels of greater than 4 degrees may result from very high emission scenarios, but can also occur from lower emission scenarios if climate sensitivity or carbon cycle feedbacks are higher than the best estimate. So if climate sensitivity, you know, if warming at X level of greenhouse gas concentrations is higher than we believe currently believe it to be, warming will be greater for any specified concentration, but also carbon cycle feedback. So what they're saying here is, to me, they're saying we can't discount the possibility that actually, Earth system tipping points might have been passed or might be passed, but we're not going to actually adequately analyze and deal with those possibilities of these tipping points in this. And I think that this is quite a common argument, sorry, not argument, but criticism of the IPCC stuff on future projections, is that they don't sufficiently take into account these risks of climate feedback loops and tipping points, such as, obviously albedo effect, permafrost methane, loss of tropical forest, etc., etc. So they are acknowledged here, but not dealt with. What does the report say about mitigation efforts so far? And here it's particularly damning. It says, okay, so it starts off with good news. Policies and laws addressing mitigation have expanded since the last report. It says there has been progress. There's participation in the Paris Agreement, virtually universal increases of energy efficiency, deforestation, technology. 18 countries have sustained emissions reductions for at least a decade. However, clearly that's not enough. So, I'm sure you're aware of NDCs. These are the pledges the countries make. So the way the Paris Agreement works is it requires every country to make a pledge, its own nationally determined contribution. What the IPCC does here is it says that all these pledges are not enough. If we add up all the emissions reductions implied by the pledges that all countries have made, they will lead to 2.8 degrees by the end of this century. That is only the very beginning, because pledges, of course, aren't worth anything. They're just promises. What counts is actual policy change. And it says there are gaps between projected emissions from implemented policies and those from the pledges. In other words, pledges aren't strong enough, and countries haven't even put in place policies that will allow them to meet their pledges. One of the starkest sentences in the whole thing's, without a strengthening of policies, global warming of 3.2 degrees is projected by 2100. 3.2 is where we're heading by 2100. Couple of things to bear in mind with 2100, with the idea of a 3.2 degree world in 2100. One, there's no evidence that our society could survive such a rapid change to 3.2, and lots of serious thinkers think just can't imagine organized human society at 3.2. So it's a collapse scenario. The other thing to bear in mind is 2100 is 77 years away. It's within the lifetimes of people already born today, not obviously hypothetical people, but my nephews and nieces. Right, sorry, I'm going to move on because we've got a lot to cover and I don't want to dawdle too much. This graph is a really, really clear indication of the rapidity of the decarbonisation needed. So the slope is annual emissions, and they're going up and up and up and up until now. The red line is the emissions, the annual emissions implied by pledges and policies. The blue line is the drop in emissions that's required by 1.5 degrees. So I think there's a couple of, obviously that drop is extremely rapid, and there's a huge gap between what's needed and what's happening. But I think one thing that's quite striking to me when I look at these graphs, and I know we're not here to talk about economies or growth or anything, but to me it seems difficult to reconcile those blue or green lines with the concept of growth. it would be hard to decrease those emissions rapidly in a steady state economy, but in a rapidly growing economy. So I think there are big implications for degrowth discussions and things like that. Okay, what does the report say about the need for rapid action? It says a very, very stark headline that you'll have seen repeated in memes and perhaps even in the media. There is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future for all. Stunning. Rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. So it's not too late. This window is apparently still open, but we need to act fast. The choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. Really, this is the most important time there has ever been, and perhaps, or ever will be. And that's the context where we have to bear in mind, thinking about all our individual and societal decision making. It's the most important time. So there's just one point I want to make here. There's a section on the benefits of near-term action, and it talks about co-benefits. So it says, for example, the economic benefits of from human health, from air quality improvement arising from mitigation action can be of the same order of magnitude as mitigation. So basically it's saying, there's lots and lots of co-benefits from decarbonizing. Just from the reduction in air pollution alone, the health benefits of reducing air pollution are more than offset the costs of decarbonization. And this is great, right? Fantastic. We all know there are lots of reasons for decarbonization. That's not why I'm thinking about this point. But what I'm thinking here is that, there is a section on the benefits of decarbonization. But we've already talked about the aerosol masking effects and, the loss of these aerosols from decarbonization. And I think what's missing here is any analysis of risks of decarbonization. We know there are benefits, but are there risks too? For example, of the loss of aerosol masking. It's a gap. It's something that's missing from this report. So what does the report say about what needs to be done? Rapid decarbonization to reach net zero as soon as possible, obviously, but again, here I think just the focus is a bit wrong here. All the focus is always on emissions, end of pipe solutions. There's not a focus on reducing the causes of emissions, which is fossil fuels and land use change. We need to focus on beginning of the pipe solutions. And the report just consistently says we need to reach zero emissions. What it should say is we need to stop burning fossil fuels and stop destroying nature. And it doesn't say that. So it's very indirect, and there are issues with that. It makes it clear that it's not when we decarbonize, it's the cumulative emissions by the time we finally do decarbonize, which makes it really important that we don't, it highlights the danger of 2050 targets. We need interim targets. We need emissions reductions front loaded to this decade. And it also makes it clear projected CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure would exceed the remaining carbon budget for 1.5. We already have more than enough fossil fuels to blow past 1.5. We really need to stop looking for more. So here is the thing about mitigation options, and there's lots of interesting things here. It highlights that solar and wind have the highest potential, but also natural climate solutions. So managing soils to regenerate, to sequester carbon in soils, restoring ecosystems, and particularly reducing conversion of ecosystems. So everything it says about mitigation, right, is all about the management of emissions. It's all about greenhouse gases, and there doesn't seem to be anything at all about solar radiation management. So I did a universal search for SRM, for the words radiation, and various things. It's just not discussed. And obviously, that's something of interest to the MEER community. I think why are other forms of mitigating global temperatures beyond greenhouse gases not discussed? I'm not here to advocate for solar radiation management. I don't know anything about it, but it's interesting. I think that there's a gap here. So what does the report say about governance? It says lots, but I just want to highlight this one thing. It highlights the role of governments. It says effective climate action is enabled by political commitment, well-aligned multi-level governance, institutional frameworks, laws, policies, strategies, enhanced access to finance and technology. It says it correctly identifies governments as the key players here. They set the rules of the game that private sector and us as individuals, the rules we have to play by. So governments are the key thing. And everything in this report, really, when it talks about the action required, is pretty much an appeal to governments. Well, not so much an appeal, but it's identifying governments as the key actors. But the thing is, what if governments have shown themselves unwilling to make the changes required? And we must come back to this point that this is not the first assessment report. It is the 6th assessment report. And I'm not denigrating the importance of the science here, but there seems to be this big gap. There's sort of a theory of change that's not really considered. There's this theory of change that, right, we'll provide information, governments will act on it. Well, governments are not acting on it. So that leads us to consider other questions, right? What do we need? What needs to happen to make them act on it? And unfortunately, this report doesn't say anything about that. So there's a small statement about how policy support is influenced by actors in civil society, including businesses, youth, women, labor, media, indigenous peoples, local communities. So it recognizes a role for other actors, but that's all there is. There's no analysis of power or vested interest or the barriers to this transition. There's no analysis of the failures and the inaction so far. There's no analysis of how change happened, social movement theory, social tipping point theory. And I think it's interesting to consider this, why is this missing? So there was some of this in, I think it's chapter 5 of Working Group 3. There was a little bit on this, but none of it made it into the synthesis report. And it's interesting to consider why. These are quite young fields and not huge compared to climate science. They're highly quantitative. They're social sciences. Maybe there's a hard science quantitative bias against social sciences. But obviously, this is a social problem that needs to change. If we need to focus on social science, or perhaps it's simply that IPCC didn't feel it was its place to discuss challenging power. I don't know, but it does lead to a key question for me, I think, and for all of us as citizens of this world. If decades of these IPCC reports haven't stimulated governments into the kinds of action we required, then what can we do to change that? And that's something for all of us to ponder, and maybe we could discuss this after. So just to sum up, this report paints a very compelling picture of both extreme urgency and vastly inadequate responses. So this is the context in which we are discussing things like land-based solar radiation management, MEER. It's a context of extreme urgency and not enough being done. I think there's a very concerning focus, and this is very, very widely acknowledged, that there's a very concerning focus on carbon dioxide removal technologies, which have feasibility concerns, and this acceptance of overshoot, rather than focusing on the hard work which needs to be done now, which is rapid decarbonisation, which is ending the fossil fuel industries. I think it's not something I'd really considered before until I was asked to give this talk. It just, you know, but it is quite striking how much of a focus on our response to this is all about managing greenhouse gas emissions, not even managing concentrations, which it should be, but emissions, rather than other forms of, you know, solar radiation management or whatever. And I think there's, as I just said, there's insufficient focus on how to actually make these changes happen. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions. You can find me online. Do email if you'd like, or you can find me on Twitter. And yeah, look forward to hearing what you thought was of interest.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie, for really pointing out, you know, in many, many pages, culling it down and pointing us toward important portions. So we're going to bring on a few people from our MEER community who'd like to ask you questions. And just a reminder, audience can send questions to Barbara Sneath in the chat, and we'll be taking your questions a little later. So we'll bring on Ilana Upita. Ilana Upita is a mother, which is why she's interested in preserving the habitat for all life on Earth for future generations. She's trying to spread the message about MEER through social media, and we do appreciate you doing that, Ilona. So welcome, and you can go ahead.
Hello. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. Very informative and very short time, because the climate change is even much more complex than what you said, like extinction of many species that are part of ecosystem and stuff like that. And my question is, because you are ecologist, that was you said, right? How much do you think ecosystem could support us? For how much longer? That would be my one question. I had one later.
That's a really interesting question, and to be honest, it's not one I've ever considered before. So I'd like to be a bit careful with how I address this. I'm not a collapsologist. I'm not a futurologist. I haven't spent much time thinking about what climate change means for prospects for humanity. I also don't know very much about the stability of agricultural systems. So I think this is fundamentally what it comes down to when we're talking about capacity of our planet to support human populations and human civilizations. It's about food production capacity. And this is really, really worrying because, it's essentially agriculture relies on climatic stability. It relies on predictability. You need to be able to predict when it's going to rain and when it's going to be warm, if you're going to know when to plant food. And there's this quite striking coincidence that all human civilizations developed in the last sort of 12,000 years, which is a period of time, a period of remarkable climatic stability, the Holocene, right? So you have this climatic stability, unusual stability, giving rise to agriculture. And with agriculture, you get the surplus of food, which allows division of labor, etc., etc. So you have civilization. We have now left the Holocene. We've left this period of climatic stability. And it's a big concern because, it's not just agricultural productivity, which is at risk. And of course, it's at risk through multiple different impacts, not just climate change. So there's, there's loss of predictability, there's increase in extreme events like floods and things which destroy land, there's loss of soil fertility because of bad practices, there's loss of pollinators because of use of insecticides. On top of that, we've got loss of animal protein from the oceans because of overfishing. It's a whole suite of problems for food production in the future, I think. And on top of that, many people also, particularly indigenous and rural communities, still rely to some extent on wild harvested foods from natural systems. And we know that natural systems are highly imperiled by climate change. So coral reefs, for example, are threatened by climate change, but 500 million people get their animal protein from coral reefs. Tropical forests are imperiled by climate change. So I can't give you numbers. I can't quantify a time by which time we can expect big problems. Like I can't estimate how many people an Earth system could support in under future scenarios, but the whole the immediate future is very, very worrying to me. Within my lifetime, and I'm 43. I think, but even then, it's wrong to think of these things as just future impacts. There are devastating impacts now. It's very easy for us in our in the industrialized north to sit here and think, oh, how bad might things get in the future? But of course, that future is already here for people in the global south. I'm sorry I can't answer your question more clearly.
But I think that you are meaning that it's quite soon. It's not in like 400 years. Like many people I tell this stuff about, and yes, maybe in like 400 years we would have a problem, but that's not the point. The problem is now.
And we'll go now to Mark Milne. Mark Milne is a director at MEER working on special assignments, including our Freetown project. He studied philosophy and works in Zurich in renewable energy. So welcome, Mark.
Thanks. And thank you, Charlie, for coming and for giving such a great talk. I know it's a little bit difficult to focus on the IPCC and then, as you have done, try to do that without being critical. But you've still managed to I think, to point out a lot of very troubling, at the very least, troubling aspects of a lot of the messages that come out of their reports, and without doing it with a hammer. Ilona actually just now touched on a subject that I wanted to ask about, but I think it's doesn't make sense if I cover that as well. But it has to do with the fact that what we see now, especially through, I guess, in a way almost orchestrated, one can imagine, through the IPCC, is a sort of requirement that this disaster, a natural disaster, self-inflicted natural disaster, is handed through the markets rather through government, which typically handles these kinds of problems, but of course has never had to face this kind of a problem. Any government in the world, something of this size. So I was thinking to ask you, this $1 million question, what do you think it will take before people start to realize that it's taxation and government and not profit-making ventures and profit-seeking thinking that is going to get us out of this? But that's not such an easy question, I think. And it's good that you already mentioned activism, which comes to my mind immediately. This is really what we need to do, is become more active as individuals, because governments have their their weak spots and their time cycles and election cycles, and this is what they tend to think about, people in government, elected officials anyway. So I wanted to actually switch and ask you about Science Rebellion or Scientist Rebellion, because you're a member of that organization, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell us how, maybe there's an angle of this, how can we do something? I mean, certainly Scientist Rebellion is one answer to that question, the formation of that group and the activities you're undertaking. But I, in particular, don't know a lot about what is being done by that group and what is planned to be done. Is there anything you can say about that in relation to, moving forward and trying to come to a faster and more meaningful responses than just throwing money at machines that will never solve anything?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for all that reflection. There's a lot of very interesting stuff you covered there. So, I mean, as I sort of said before, I really think, and I think it's quite widely recognised now that the way we get out of this is to reach social tipping points, whereby there are so many people demanding change that it becomes inevitable. So many people, expressing their values that fossil fuel industries become widely acknowledged as unethical and that they need to go. So many people standing in the way of destructive things that it becomes hard to stick to the bad old ways, and change becomes inevitable. But I think it all comes down to social tipping points, reaching a critical mass of people, however many people that is, to make these things inevitable. So the question is, how do we get there? And of course, it's really, really difficult when faced not just with hugely powerful and resurgent misinformation industry, but media that don't cover the issues, and just this general societal silence about it. And this is why I think activism is so powerful. There's this famous psychology experiment where they got experimental participants to come and sit in a waiting room. They thought they were going for an interview, so they sit in a waiting room and they pump smoke under the door. And when participants are alone, they react to the smoke, and they almost all very, very quickly go and find someone to let them know that there's this problem that needs to be addressed. But then they repeated the experiment with paid actors who are also, they're asked to sit in the waiting room to obviously notice the smoke, but to not react. And then what happens then is, with the study participants, they notice the smoke as normal, but when they see other people not reacting, they think, oh, it can't actually be something to worry about. I don't want to embarrass myself by overreacting. So they tend to just sit there. And they don't act. So it's called the bystander effect. And I think this is the situation we're in a society. Everyone's heard the message. We've all heard that it's an emergency, right? But nobody is acting as if it's an emergency. So it sends this very strong signal that it's actually nothing to worry about. And this is where I think scientists have a particular role. If we say it's an emergency and then we just go to work tomorrow morning, concentrate on the next grant and the next paper, then our behavior doesn't match our words. And it's our behavior that influences people, not our words. If I was to say to you now that I can smell smoke coming through up the stairs, and I'm worried that there's a fire in my house right now, but then I was to carry on giving this talk, of course you would not believe me that there is a fire in my house, because my actions just don't match that. So this is the thinking behind Scientist Rebellion and Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. Scientists are respected, authoritative members of society. We believe that the greatest power we can have as individuals lies beyond our professional work, and it lies in visibly, loudly acting as if it's an emergency in order to try and catalyze urgent action amongst others. So we take part in arrestable actions. At COP26 in Glasgow 2 years ago, we carried out the first ever mass arrest of scientists. We blocked a bridge with chains around our necks. As far as we know, this was the first ever mass arrest of scientists in this emergency. And we did that because it sends, it sends a clear signal. It's not something you see every day, a mass arrest of scientists. And it's, we hope to get people thinking, why the fuck are scientists out in the streets getting arrested? Things must be bad, actually, if scientists were to get arrested. So we see activism as the ultimate form of our communication. We've said it's an emergency, now we're trying to communicate that in more effective ways. Within the UK, there is Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, which is part of the core Extinction Rebellion movement. But then globally, there is Scientist Rebellion, which is outside of Extinction Rebellion, but a sister movement. They're quite similar in scope and what we do, but Scientist Rebellion is global in focus. And there are, so the last global rebellion, I think we had over 1,000 scientists took part in actions in over 28 countries on every continent. So you do look up Scientist Rebellion in your country. We're on all the social media channels, and you can find our website. If you're in the UK, do look up Scientists for Extinction Rebellion also.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Mark. So we're going to open it up now to questions from our general audience. I have a question that's come in from Kristen, and Kristen asks, does mentioning but not dealing with, aka factoring in, the feedback loops and aerosol masking essentially render the IPCC's data largely meaningless? Or you could say, how meaningful or meaningless is this data, considering how off the mark? Yeah.
I certainly don't think it's meaningless. I think, yeah. So I think it's hugely important that these reports exist. There has to be something authoritative and that is agreed by all. There has to be something we can all point to. Yeah, my starting point is always that this, I'm a strong believer in the IPCC. If we are aware of the caveats. Now, of course, the projections are only a small part of what the report contains. Everything about impacts, everything's about what's happened so far. This is all rock solid science, and can't be argued with. When talking about projections, it does concern me that there is insufficient attention paid to these feedback loops. I think that's a real problem. So I would always say that the projections are beyond conservative. I wouldn't say I can't remember the precise term you used. I certainly wouldn't say they're useless, but they are, they're incredibly conservative. And so it's really worrying just to hear that they say, under the best case emission scenario, we're definitely going to surpass 1.5 degrees without even considering feedback loops. So things are bad. Things are really bad. I wouldn't poo-poo their projections entirely, but yeah, they need to include these feedback loops. And it's interesting to consider why they don't. I don't know if it's just complexity. We are dealing with vastly complex and little known systems, and perhaps and this is just me, thinking completely about this for the first time, and from no particular position, but perhaps, if your objective is to produce concrete outputs, right, the governments can use, if your objective is to be able to put your finger on a number, then maybe that creates an incentive to simplify the system you're dealing with. Because if you dealt with the full complexity of it, you just couldn't ever come up with a number. It's just too complex. So maybe that's why, I don't know. But certainly, yeah, these there needs to be much more attention paid to these Earth system feedbacks and these carbon cycle feedbacks.
I have a question from Peter. Given that the international community is putting all their eggs in the drawdown basket, do you think that CO2 drawdown is even feasible given the energy and scale of resources needed? You've referred to that a little bit. Never mind the technology. The biggest plant in the world draws down 4 seconds worth of emissions in 1 year right now. That's just where we're at with the technology.
It's shocking, the emphasis on it. It really is. Apart from anything, just because it's a distraction, right? What needs to happen is we need to stop putting these gases into the atmosphere. And, that's just pure common sense. If your bath is overflowing, you don't start your long journey to the shops to go and buy a mop. You turn off the tap, right? And, we will need the mop. And so I'm not saying I don't think we should stop all research on CDR and stuff. The bath is overflowing. We're going to need a mop. And ultimately, it's not emissions that count after all, is it? It's concentrations, and concentrations are already too high. So even if we got emissions down to zero, we still need to reduce concentrations. We need to draw that down somehow. So yeah, I think the emphasis on technological solutions is hugely misguided. We need to turn off the tap, and all our attention needs to be on turning off the tap as soon as possible. And obviously, it's magical thinking to provide an excuse to allow us to carry on emitting a bit longer, and it's bullshit, obviously. The other thing I'd say about drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is, we don't need technological solutions because nature can do that for us. Now, obviously, nature doesn't do it in a way that can be monetized in quite the same obvious way, but nature can do that job for us. Protecting existing ecosystems, restoring soils, can do that job much more effectively than whatever factories we have. So any investments that we're putting into this needs to go into nature, not magical technologies. However, there is a real urgency here, because as this report made clear, these natural climate solutions, these forests will absorb carbon dioxide now, but unless we arrest the heat, they're not going to do that in the future. So the window of time for using natural drawdown is really rapidly closing. And of course, the flip side, the implication of that, what's left unsaid, is the feedback loops. At the moment, before we reach particular tipping points, nature is potentially a big carbon sink. It can be a big weapon in our arsenal for drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we let it get too warm, then the reverse will happen, and ecosystems will die. And not only will we have lost this big weapon in our arsenal, but these sinks will turn into saucers and will emit huge amounts more greenhouse gases, which really would be an irreversible pathway to hell. So it's, again, all these things they always come back to the same answer, which is rapid decarbonisation now. As quickly as possible, we need to stop burning fossil fuels and stop destroying nature.
Okay, yeah, and we at MEER are also just, we're thinking so much and taking action around the temperature that is rapidly increasing. So I have one other question. We'll finish up with Barbara's question, and this is, can scientists actually change the IPCC process? Can scientists change the policy discussion from projections of temperature to projections of risk? For example, the capacity of natural systems to sequester carbon dioxide will be decreased as global heating increases. Or, for example, zombie forests will go up in smoke unless we actually cool the planet.
I can't answer the question, I'm afraid, because I just don't know enough about the IPCC process. I've never been an author, so I don't know. Logically, since the IPCC process is dependent on the scientists that volunteer their time to take part in it, logically those scientists do hold the power ultimately, just in the same way that a workforce, the labour workforce ultimately holds the power in any industry. So yeah, sure. I think scientists presumably could change the process, but it would require organisation. It would require agreement that it needs to be that needs to be done. It would require them to organise themselves into a powerful force, and then it would require them to apply their power in a meaningful and effective way. Whether that needs to be done, I don't know. But yeah, I presume they would have the power if they wanted to.
Okay, well, Charlie, we really thank you for coming on to have this talk with us today and to share everything that you have gleaned from that report. So thank you. And
it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. At MEER, we are working to help educate the public while also developing a solution to the warming on the planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and about climate science on our website. We are an almost 100% volunteer staff, only a few paid researchers at the moment. So please consider making a monthly donation of any amount if you've enjoyed being here or if you learned something today. And you can go to our YouTube channel, MEER SRM. We also have Facebook and Twitter. Check us out. And we value your presence here in the MEER community. We would love to see you again on Sunday, June 4th, when we'll be speaking with Tom Goro about saving coral reefs from extinction. So please mark that date. And then on Sunday, July 2nd, we'll be featuring Jem Bendel in a talk entitled Breaking Together, a Freedom-Loving Response to Collapse. So we look forward to seeing you again and wish you well.